And welcome to our inaugural OffMessage podcast.
The very first one.
The very first one. We are currently outside the Washington, D.C. swamp here in the OnMessage headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia. The second best OnMessage office, the best one being in Annapolis, Maryland.
Not really a debate.
Not a competition. And we are going to be here today to talk about polling. And we're going to talk about politics. We're going to talk about Trump's first 100 days in office. We're going to talk about whether or not his approval rating on immigration has actually eroded in the last few months, like the Democrats and the media say. And we're going to debunk some bogus polling. And in doing so, answer some questions like, has the president's support actually eroded? Is deportation still popular? And we're going to maybe get into whether or not the Kentucky Derby this weekend is going to see journalism win the race, or is he that's a horse?
It is a horse,
Yeah.
but I can tell that you've been paying a lot of attention to that.
Yeah, I'm deeply involved.
We'll talk about it at the end.
Okay, well, we'll get into maybe some Kentucky stuff at the end of it. But this is the OffMessage podcast with my friend and colleague, Henry Parkhurst, and I'm Sam Kay. So, Henry, why don't you break down a little bit for us the big picture, kind of what we're looking at here, what we're going to be talking about today, and just dive in.
Yeah, definitely. Well, like Sam mentioned, our goal here is to sort of interpret the polling that we've been seeing coming out of our own shop and sort of just national public opinion polls that have been, in the news space, and try to make sense of them. What are we seeing coming out of the White House? What can we believe? And how are they really reacting to what they're seeing? So today we want to start off with a poll that's been getting a lot of attention in the news cycle recently, and that's this new poll that came out from ABC, and they covered a lot of topics, but the ones that we're most interested in are they released numbers on Trump's job approval and as well as his approval on specific issues, economy, immigration, etc. And so I think that's probably a good place for us to start, and we can compare that poll to stuff that we've been seeing internally. So to start, this poll by ABC was released just a few weeks ago. It was in the field from April 18th to 22nd of 2025, so pretty timely for us. But whenever we see a poll, I think that a game that's worth us playing is we try to unpack, it's almost like we're interviewing the poll. We want to ask it questions like, how many people are in this poll? How did they ask the question?
Right. Can it help me get a girlfriend?
Anything would help at this point. So, which people are they asking? And so there's questions that we want to try to figure out to understand the validity of the poll. So for this poll, they interviewed close to 2,500 U.S. adults. And the first thing that stands out to us here, when we do political polls is what does it mean to actually talk to an adult versus a registered voter?
Right. And this survey is all U.S. adults.
All U.S. adults. And the difference here is that not every U.S. adult shows up to vote.
Right. Not even everyone is registered to vote.
Exactly. And while there's merits for some sort of questions, if I wanted to know the most popular ice cream flavor in America, I wouldn't necessarily need to talk to voters.
Absolutely.
But when we're doing political opinion, it's a much more relevant universe for us is often likely voters.
Right.
And
what's a likely voter?
A likely voter is someone who's not only registered to vote, but tells us that they're going to vote in an upcoming election or in a past election. And so when we do surveys, particularly on these political topics, we want to be talking to likely voters because those are the ones who show up in the elections and will be deciding the outcome. It doesn't really matter as much to us what a general U.S. adult is saying. Another thing that stands out to me about this poll that they released is how they released it. Or sorry, not how they released it, but how they collected the interviews for it. And so there's a bunch of different options when we do a survey. We can do live caller surveys. We can do text to web, which I know you like a lot, right?
We do love text to web surveys here at OnMessage.
But and then the way that this poll did it is a more cost-effective option that some people use, and that was an online panel. And the thing about online panels is that they recruit people to be participants of this panel. Sometimes it's a monetary incentive, sometimes they get rewards based on how many polls they take, but they're I think, to use maybe not so generous of a term, they're kind of like lab rat surveys. There's a certain type of person who wants to take this survey, and that's what we're seeing with this poll. But let's get to the meat of it. This poll released that 39% of U.S. adults approve of Trump's job over these first 100 days. Shockingly low. Like Biden levels of low support.
Which is hard to believe, frankly, and kind of what we're going to debunk right here.
Right. And then on the flip side, 55% disapprove. So I wanted to get your initial thoughts on that. When you see those numbers, that's a negative 16% net margin. What stands out to you there?
Well, I think it's just too low to be believable. A guy that the president, after he was elected and after he was inaugurated, he was hovering around 50% job approval. So to me, for it to have decreased by 11%, I just don't believe that to be the case. And when I look at something like the fact that it's a U.S. adults survey and not a likely voter survey, when I look at kind of how many demographics they weighted by, manipulating the data on the back end to try and fit it to a likely electorate, it just it doesn't really give me a lot of credibility in the survey. It doesn't give me a lot of belief that the survey is accurate. So when I see a 39%, I could believe that there was a honeymoon period and we've kind of come back from that honeymoon period for the president. But I don't imagine that it's that low on his overall job approval. And that's also not where places like Real Clear Politics, which does an aggregate on all of the polls that have his job approval, I think for them it's like at the 45%. So this is a kind of an outlier, I'd say, compared to other surveys.
Mm-hmm. You brought up a good point there, and that's the weighting thing. And so when we take a survey, no matter how you take it, we get all of this raw data in on the back end. And of course, we're hoping that demographically our demographics of the survey represent and reflect what we know to be true about whether it's an electorate or U.S. adults. So there's reason to say, why you would want to have the right gender mix of your survey, why you want to have the right party mix. But for each one of those sort of levers you switch to make it more accurate, you affect every other question in the survey. And so when I look at this survey, they report when they released their methodology that they weighted gender, race, education, region, income, 2024 presidential vote, and party. That's 7 or 8 variables that they're messing with. And to me, when I see that number, it makes me doubt the integrity of the other questions they ask, because they're it's almost like they had a lumpy ball of clay and they're trying to smooth the whole thing over, not really understanding what it might do to the other side of the ball of clay.
Absolutely. They're kind of cherry picking when you do this. You're cherry picking what percentage of this survey is female, what percentage is African American, what percentage is identifying as Republican, as Democrat. And we've talked about this before. A lot of that is kind of the art of polling. A pollster does have to make some of those decisions on the back end after the data is collected. But when we look at kind of a public pollster like this from Washington Post, from ABC News, we can imagine that they've probably taken a more liberal view of the electorate, when we know, based off of the popular vote in 24, that the electorate was, even though it was maybe a little bit female, it was conservative. It was a conservative electorate, and Trump won the popular vote, the national popular vote, which is what a survey like this is supposed to represent, by 1.5%. And so that's kind of what I would expect a party break to be on a survey like this, and we don't see that. And so I think it's a risky move to weight by that many demographics.
Well, the next part of this poll that I really wanted to dive into is the approval that they reported on Trump's job, specifically on immigration. They said 46% of U.S. adults approve his job and 53% disapprove of it. What stands out to you about that on first glance?
Well, again, I just think it's low. I don't think Trump has had that low of an approval rating on immigration, definitely not in his first term. And I think if you were to have asked voters who they were to trust, and we definitely saw some of this in polling in the campaign, who do you trust more on the issue of immigration, Trump or Kamala Harris or Biden, depending on when you surveyed it? Trump had, a double-digit net lead on that kind of question. So I don't believe this number. I also think that we've seen in some places, when we asked what's the most important issue facing the country, it used to be 30% of the country said that immigration was their number one issue, and now that's come way down to less than 10%. And why is that? Because the president has addressed the immigration crisis. We haven't had any border crossings basically in April, and he's deporting a lot of the criminals and removing the people on the removal list. So I don't believe that the number's that low, and we have data ourselves that shows that it's not that low.
And even in focus groups that you and I have both done this year, we've seen, leading up to last campaign cycle, people were consistently saying, like you mentioned, that immigration and the border were a top issue for them. They tell us qualitatively, hey, I voted for Donald Trump because of this issue, and now it's not a concern for me, which is a glowing endorsement of the fact that he is doing what the people asked him to do, and he's doing a good job of it. So
sorry, but I just think some of that is probably, and I know we're going to get into this today, but I think some of that is these examples that the media has sensationalized or tried to weaponize. The Kilmer Abrego Garcia example, these deportations where they've tried to make us sympathetic to what the Department of Homeland Security has deemed terrorists in our country. And I think it's good to get them out. And once the full stories about them is released and the DHS is able to kind of get that information in front of the American public, I think that these independents who are maybe concerned about Trump's, on this specific poll, which is U.S. adults and weighted, the independents maybe that have changed their mind on immigration for Trump will come back once they kind of see the results.
Definitely. Well, let's turn now to polls that we just put in the field. We see these polls in the national headlines, and we conduct our own research. And so I think it's worth comparing how we got our answers and what we're seeing and how it differs from what's been released here.
Definitely. Well, so we took a national survey also in mid-April. The field dates were April 16th to 17th. It was a text-to-web survey, like we said, which is a better methodology than the panel survey that came from the Washington Post ABC poll, because we do probability, we do random distribution, and we have a geographic frame that is set on the front end, not set on the back end, which I think a lot of these guys do. And then we have 1,000 likely voters, so different likely voters than adults. These are people we believe are actually going to show up to vote in the 26 midterms, and so we think that this survey would be a likely representation of that electorate.
Well, let's dive into what the survey actually said. So we asked the question, and you and I think we're bouncing back and forth over the little wall in between our offices about how to frame this question. And I think you brought up a good point that we have to frame it in the way that the administration talks about it. And so
because we want to know if our messaging is working.
Exactly.
We want to know if the administration's messaging is working.
So we asked the question this way: do you agree or disagree with the following statement? America has been overwhelmed by illegal immigration, and our infrastructure simply can't handle it. We need to continue President Trump's deportation efforts and remove most of the illegal immigrants that came over in the last 4 years. And we saw a great response to this question. 55% of likely voting Americans agree with this statement. 48% strongly agree.
Right. And that 55%, I think that's the sweet spot. That's where you want to be when you're coalition building, because there's not a lot of issues out there that are both that the vast majority of the American public cares about, where you can really get to 70 or 80%. And so, but you can get to that 55, 60% spot, which is a coalition. You can see that center-right coalition on the slide there. We're winning 96% of Republicans and 52% of independents. So we've got a nice center-right coalition. We even get 13% of Democrats. But what I really like is that men really agree with us on that and women split with us. So there's definitely some sentiment still, even after the deportations, even after Garcia was deported, even after the media and Democrats spin on this issue, we're still seeing that Americans believe we're overrun with illegal immigrants and that we got to get most of them out.
Definitely. I think a lot of the media spin that I've been seeing is, how could the Trump administration be doing it? Why is it focused on all of this stuff? And I think that response from the media has, to me, come off as like a clear reflection of the fact that they didn't understand what this election was about for voters. They didn't understand why people supported Trump in the first place. When we were doing polling throughout the last year leading up to his cycle, we saw immigration breaking in Trump's favor and Republicans' favor by massive margins. Over the summer, we saw that we asked, which party do you trust more when it comes to illegal immigration at the southern border? 56% said the Republican Party. We asked them about a bunch of different policy options that the Trump campaign was talking about implementing should it win last election. We saw 61% support building a border wall. We saw 67% support ending catch and release. We saw 73% support remain in Mexico. And that sort of brings us to a head of what there's been a lot of news about recently. We saw 69% say that they support the deportation of illegal immigrants currently in the United States. So these policies leading up to Trump administration, or leading up to this Trump administration, were things that the American voters said that they wanted.
Right. And so looking at kind of some of this data where maybe a year ago it was like 70% for overall deportation, and now we've come back a little bit to maybe 55% support for deportation. Do you think that there has been an erosion, or is this just different types of polling, or, maybe why are we seeing some of this change? Why some of the change there?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I want to say on that is the 55% number that we saw just this past month is still an incredibly strong number. If you get 55% of Americans to agree with it, that means you're not just getting Trump voters. You're getting people who did not vote for Trump who are still saying they agree.
Maybe a few Democrats too, probably, yeah.
So first off, I think that is still a very strong number. So to call it a slip, I think misrepresents what's happening. What I really do think is happening more than anything is that there are people who see a question like this framed in the light of it being the Trump administration, and they just immediately put their party jersey on. Whether they didn't vote for Trump, whether they don't like the guy, whatever it is, they're saying, well, if Trump did it, I can't be for it. But here, if we ask the straight read on the question, the policy remains popular. I think what I see more than anything is, whether it's a voter or whether it's the media, it's because Trump is doing it that they want to give it a negative spin, even though the core of the policy is something that a strong majority of Americans support.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he said in his State of the Union that it wasn't a State of the Union, his joint congressional address, that anything he does, the Democrats are just going to do the opposite for, and they won't applaud him on anything. And I think that's true generally. I mean, can you imagine what Biden's reelection campaign would have been like had he kept the border closed? I mean, it just feels like that is such an easy issue. He was handed a closed border by President Trump, and he opened it because President Trump was against an open border. And so what do the Democrats have to do? Do the opposite. And that was probably his biggest fumble. Things like Afghanistan also really turned his administration upside down. But the long-term fumble of, day after day of Fox News live streaming, people streaming across the border with caravans, I think that really damaged Biden. And Trump has kind of delivered on his promise to close the border and begin deportations. And I think generally speaking, the American public supports that.
Well, we want to turn to what we saw on Trump's job approval in this poll.
On Trump's job approval, on this survey that we took, this national likely voter survey from mid-April, we saw that 49% of voters approve of his job approval and 51% disapprove. So that's kind of different than what we're kind of seeing in the national surveys. And I think that's because our methodology is a bit more accurate than some other folks. Again, we do likely voters, and maybe we'll get into this in another pod, but in our election prediction surveys that we released right before the election, we were fairly accurate.
You're allowed to pat yourself on the back every
it's
once
not
in a
just
while.
me. It's mostly our partner and president of polling, Wes Anderson, is our really the brains of the operation. But we were accurate, and so I think that one of the differences is that we believe in coalitions that can be built with Republicans and independents, and I do think that right now maybe this is a little bit of a rosy read, maybe a teeny bit. But I don't think that it's tanked to that 39, that sub 40% that we're seeing in the Washington Ipsos poll. And what I like about this is several things. One is, even if he's a little bit lower than this, let's say 47% in his actual, if you could survey every single person in the country, it would say 47% approval. I think that's an incredibly high watermark compared to his first term. People forget that the average approval rating he had in his first term was 41%, according to Gallup. And some of his high watermarks on like maybe 3 to 5 occasions was 45% or 47%. So he's still sitting above a level than what he was at in the first term. And then, yes, I think it has come down a little bit since the honeymoon of the inauguration and the win. He really kind of captured the American zeitgeist going into the election and, turned it into this this powerful thing that young men and, folks, Hispanic men really wanted to get involved in. And maybe it's come back a little bit, but again, when we look at kind of the Republican support, it hasn't changed. When we look at support among young men, it really hasn't changed very much. And so I think maybe there's been a bit of a downturn among like older voters, 65 plus, which seem to be leaning a bit more Democrat than typical. But I think that if he's in that -5 range, that's still a vast improvement from where he was in the first term. And I think it shows that he's built a stronger coalition than the first time. And I believe it'll be sticky like it was the first time around.
Right. I think for me, something that stands out is the contrast to Biden's numbers. If you went, into the tail end of his last term, we were seeing him below 40. We were seeing him at 37, 38, 39%. And so just think about this. Trump's outpacing that by about a good 10 points. And so I think, voters told us in focus groups that this was a change election to them. And I think that some people, the media wants to call this a slip. I still think this is a marketed demonstration that Trump promised change and is delivering it. It's an uptick in support that a lot of people didn't expect to see, to the point where people thought Trump had no chance of winning the election. I think this number tells us definitively that the Trump administration's campaign had much more momentum behind it. Obviously, he won the election despite the fact that a lot of the media said there was no way he was doing it. But that's not just saying it was a fluke. His approval number here says it's because people wanted it and they like the policies that are in place.
What I like to remind myself, looking at kind of the swift execution of Trump's plan in the last 100 days, is this is the time to swing for the fences. This is 4 years out from another presidential election. It's 18, 19 months out from a midterm election. When else are you supposed to go 100% all out on, tariffs and deportations and, mass changes to the executive branch? Like, you don't want to do it in the September before the 26 midterms, right? You do it immediately when you take office because it gives you time to let things marinate, build messaging and strategy, and claw back any, loss that you take from changes in voter public opinion.
Definitely. I mean, I just wish you could give that kind of speech to the Wake Forest men's baseball team. Like, they could really use to start swinging for the fences, but I don't know.
Have they not been playing well?
It's a lie. We've been supposed to be the best team in college baseball for like the past 2 years, and it's kind of falling off. I think there's a chance that they turn it around in time for Omaha, but we still got to see on that.
Yeah, well, the Knicks got to go up against the Celtics in the second round here, so I'm pretty worried about that.
I really think you like stole a win in Detroit last night, but it is what it is.
Yeah. The refs are on our side, and I don't care.
That's sometimes you got to have it that way. But okay, let's turn now to the case that's really been the crux of a lot of the media attention, and that's the case of Kilmar Abrega Garcia. We stuck him on our poll because we had no agenda with this question. We wanted to know where the American people lie, and so I think it's worth us looking through this and sort of debunking the media narrative about this case, because the Democrats and a lot of the mainstream media have suggested that this is a huge chink in Donald Trump's armor, that this case is going to somehow sink him and is going to turn the American people against his policies on immigration. But I think our data shows that pointedly is not the case.
Right, absolutely. So, yeah, we asked this great question, which tried to give out both arguments. The Trump administration recently deported an El Salvadoran illegal immigrant, stating he was an MS-13 gang member. Democrats claim he was deported without due process. Do you support or oppose the decision to deport him? And it's incredible. It's a direct split down the middle. This is from our survey, our National Likely Voter Survey. 49% support the decision to deport him and 49% oppose it. You're seeing it's kind of about split, maybe a slight lean towards oppose among independents. And we've got an interesting gender gap there where men support it and women don't. But it's marginal. It's less than 10% pretty much, the gap both ways. So I think that what is showing is on an issue like this, which has been sensationalized by the media, the facts are complicated. You could kind of lean one way depending on which source you're reading. And we're seeing that the American people just put their jersey on. And this is pretty much what the national popular vote was. Trump got 49% of the vote and Kamala Harris got 48.5% of the vote or something like that. So it's very close to the actual percentage of the popular vote, which just shows that I think on an issue like this and on similar issues where the Democrats and the media are just going to keep kind of weaponizing it and attacking the president with a story like this, it's just going to make everybody put on their partisan jerseys, like you said, and kind of dig their heels in and not really change any of their opinions.
My question looking at this number is, if I'm a Democrat strategist right now, I don't see how you look at this number and consider it a win when you put it in context when it comes to party trust on the border and the popularity of so many of the Trump illegal immigration reforms. He's effectively shut down the border, which Americans are telling us is super popular. They tell us they trust and prefer the Republican Party platform on abortion. So I don't really get why they're digging their heels. And I guess what stands out to me is in 2022, we saw them have success running a message on abortion. In 2024, they tried to run back that message on abortion and add in this sort of Trump is a existential threat to democracy. He's going to end American government as you know it message. And they lost.
Right.
And
Bigly.
Bigly is probably a fair way to describe it. And we've seen them in disarray since then. And I understand maybe, if you're in disarray, you just want to throw anything at the dartboard and do it. But this has a chance. I think the more attention that they put on immigration probably hurts them in the long run, because the more that they keep the narrative on Trump and immigration, that's just playing to his wheelhouse, to Republicans' wheelhouse. I want to get your thoughts on that.
I don't know why Democrats would think they could suddenly become the party that's trusted on immigration. They're the party that wants open borders. They're the ones that want to give illegal immigrants health care. They're the ones that want to allow non-citizens to vote. So it's like, why would they suddenly become the party to trust on this issue? I just don't imagine that the American public, after voting for deportations, voting for a closed border wall, voting to change some of these policies, remain in Mexico and, catch and release, and then to have maybe some, complicated elements to that, the implementation of that policy, and suddenly the Democrats become the party of immigration. I just don't see it. And so I agree with you. I think it's a mistake for them to dig in on this issue. I'm not really sure where they're supposed to go exactly, because they have no leader, they have no message, and they have no coalition right now. But it seems like they should probably go elsewhere than on immigration for sure.
Picking this fight confuses me. I think to give credit where it's due, I think in some of the Democrats, post-election, what happened, reflections, I think it was Bernie Sanders who identified that the party has clearly fallen out of touch with what matters most to the American electorate, what matters to everyday working class people. What surprises me is that those exact people are telling you that this is an issue that they care about. There's other places that the Democrats could go. They could focus on universal health care. They could focus on, living wages in America. They could focus on the economy. I know we've seen some volatility in the stock market. It sounds like there are concerns that you could go and have conversations about what the American people need. But this is just seems like a wholesale miss to me.
I think a part of the culture of the Democrat Party is they look for victims, and they kind of they have the victim pyramid, which, Ben Shapiro has talked about a lot. If you're a disabled, black, trans, person, then you get to say what the law should be in the country, and you get to have, all the rights of, to decide what happens, because you're at the top of the victim pyramid, and, white straight men are at the bottom. That's where we would be in this hierarchy.
Someone's got to do
it. So I think when they see these kinds of cases, it's just like an instinct. It's like, oh, we have an El Salvadoran, American, not really an American, illegal immigrant who, got deported. Like, we got to go fight for that guy. And I think it's actually a bad look for them, because when you have Chris Van Hollen, who is spending his time in El Salvador and not spending his time talking about issues that Marylanders care about, taxes and concerns that are home, that are domestic, I think it's a bad look. It makes them look like they care more about illegal immigrants than it does about everyday Americans who are struggling. So
yeah, I think that takes us to what should the Trump administration and Republicans in general do going forward with all this negative media attention they're getting. For me, my interpretation of this is you don't have to change the course. This one case, no matter how much media attention it gets, does not disprove the attitudes of the American people. We've seen that they still support deportation, because we knew that's what Trump was campaigning on, and those policies remain, very, very popular. And so I think there's no real need to say that, oh, we need to duck and cover from this media coverage. I think this is still an area where you can lean in. There's really just the path forward for Republicans on immigration, in my opinion, needs to be offense.
Absolutely. And I think one of the brilliant strategies of the Trump, Susie Wiles team is they pick people for the cabinet who are great at messaging. They're picking folks who can be in front of the camera and talk about what the administration cares about. And I think that gives them a real leg up.
I think before we wrap up here, we want to just touch base on some other polling that we've seen come out, some other races that have started to get some media attention here. And one of the more interesting open seats that we're looking at is out in Kentucky. Mitch McConnell has been there since the mid 80s, and he's stepping down now. So there's going to be an open seat for the first time there, or at least for his seat in a very long time. I want to get your thoughts on what's going on out there.
Yeah, wow. Well, yeah, I mean, you're the Kentucky expert, man, but I would say that I think it's going to be a really interesting primary. You've got our guy, Daniel Cameron. We're Team Cameron over here at OnMessage. We love him. He's run statewide before. Phenomenal candidate, and I think he's got a real shot. There was a McLaughlin poll that came out pretty recently, I think within the last few weeks, that showed him hovering at 44% in the primary over some other candidates. Andy Barr, who is a congressman and decided to jump in the race, and then Nate Morris, who's kind of been I'm not really sure or familiar too much with him, but basically I think he was did something in climate, garbage cans or something. Built a business off, collecting trash or something like that, and now is trying to get in this race. He's only at 2%, but I think it's going to be a really interesting election. But yeah, I mean, you're the expert, man. I'm curious.
I mean, so I was out with Cameron on his 2023 campaign for governor. I love the guy personally, but I think he should be set up in a really great position. Not only has he run a statewide campaign before, the Republican primary base out there loves him. I mean, that's a man who had protesters stand on his front porch for weeks on end, telling him to change his opinion. But he stood up for the values of Kentucky, protecting law and order out there, and so he's been in the fire before. That's not to say that Andy Barr hasn't done good things in Congress, but I think, Daniel Cameron knows what it means to run a campaign for all of Kentucky.
He was the Attorney General, right?
Yeah, he was the Attorney General during the Breonna Taylor case. That sort of got him, a lot of media attention. He's met with Donald Trump in the White House. He had Beyonce writing him letters and all this stuff. And so he stood attacks from the left before. He knows what it means to run a statewide campaign in Kentucky. And so we're obviously feeling really optimistic about it.
You got to know his mom, right? While you were working on that case?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think I was out somewhere. What was the name of the town? I was out in like Litchfield, Kentucky, and I was driving back to Louisville. And his mom knew that I had to be there, and so she gave me a phone call, and she said, "I don't care. I know you're driving back through Elizabethtown. That's Daniel's hometown." He says, "I got a ham in the oven. I'll take care of it for you." So I stopped by and had dinner with Sandra Cameron for a little bit, but she's well. So hope she's still doing well. But
that's cool. And then the Derby's this weekend, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the entire state's been shut down for the past month. But when I was out there, it was like it was like the third holiest day of the year. You know, we got Easter, we got Christmas, and then there's like the Kentucky Derby pretty much follows up with it. So the entire state goes down. But I'm pretty excited. I'm hoping to have some friends over for some mint juleps tomorrow.
But so journalism is a horse in the race, right?
Journalism is a horse. Personally, I love the horse. The horse got 3 out of its past 4 races. It's won, and it's looked like a monster out there. But, you know, I was talking with Brad Todd, one of our partners, earlier, and he made a good point. He's like, you know, Henry, it is a good horse, but I just don't really see any way that journalism can win with Trump in the White House. so that's where we're at, but I'm excited to tune in. You know, Kentucky's going to be fun to keep its eye on all year, and, you know, hoping for the best for both journalism and Cameron going forward.
Well, that's great. Well, awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for tuning into the inaugural podcast, and hopefully we'll check on you next time.